Meet my flat Wesley. And please notice that he has a little triangle that he's carrying. So I would like for you to hear me today speak about flat Wesley and the triangle of grace. So let's talk about triangles for a minute. We're going to talk about more than one triangle today. First, we're going to start with triangular trade. This is an historian's term for trade anywhere, anytime between three locations. But most famously, it is used to describe the slave trade. Leg one was usually from Europe to the west coast of Africa, and the trade goods that were carried were maybe copper, cloth, a lot of cloth, and especially from England, because that's what we're going to talk about today is England, or guns and ammunition. When they offloaded these materials in West Africa, they picked up a load of slaves. Then they took the slaves across the Atlantic on what is known as the Middle Passage, and this has a dark and meaningful connotation to black people in America today. But the slaves were taken to British colonies in the New World, and after the American Revolution, they were primarily taken to the Caribbean islands, Jamaica, Bermuda, whatnot. The slaves were offloaded, and what was loaded on was almost exclusively molasses. This was taken to England for the processing of rum. The sugar cane was grown by the slaves, and it was processed into molasses by the slaves, and it was loaded by the slaves. And so here you have people who have been traded for copper or cloth and brought over here to work themselves to death in the hottest job ever. And then when they returned to England on the third leg, they unloaded the molasses, started the whole triangle all over again. They took it back from Rome. I don't know. It's awful to think about. Well, John Wesley, Black Wesley, was a keen abolitionist. He had a publication entitled Thoughts on Slavery, and in it he denounced slavery as the sum of all villainies. He declared that every human being had the right to liberty at birth. I mean, he said this a lot more vehemently, I think, than I am right now, because Wesley was a very, very, very good preacher. But perhaps even more important than his preaching and teaching and writing about this was his mentorship of two other men, John Newton and William Wilberforce. John Newton was born in the middle 1700s. He was slightly younger than Wesley. He was apprenticed to the sea by his father when he was really just a child. And he grew up working in this triangular trade and on slave ships. And then he worked his way up to being captain of this triangular trade and of a slave ship. He even did drawings on how you could lay them in their beds chained up so that you could get 2 or 3 more on each ship. It was awful. He was as hard-hearted a man as you'd ever want to find in that slave business. But he was caught in a storm off the coast of Ireland on his return to England on that third leg. As the ship broke up around him, he was miraculously saved. And with his physical salvation became, it was also a religious salvation. He devoted himself from then on to becoming a serving, working Christian. He knew that he had done wrong, and he wanted to make up for it. He became an ordained Anglican priest, but he was preaching already anti-slavery material, and he wasn't all that popular in that odd and peculiar way that ministers are selected and given churches by wealthy people in England, and something that, there's a lot of things in England that we just in our American minds don't understand, and I think that's one of them. But he got so desperate he even applied to the Methodists for a job. But eventually the Church of England relented and gave him a position, and as an Anglican priest he continued to be more and more anti-slavery and more vocal about it as he aged. And he became the mentor for William Wilberforce. Okay, so who's William Wilberforce? Well, he was the youngest of these three men, and he lived a dissolute life as a young man and traveled to Europe. And at some point in this European trip, he became converted to an evangelical form of Christianity. And when he returned, he realized the deprivation of slavery. Not only for the slaves, God knows it was for them, but for the people who trafficked in it. He was in a position, though, to do something about it because he was a member of Parliament. In 1807, just 3 days before John Newton's death, he managed to push through the British Slave Trade Bill, which prohibited slave trade and put an end to this triangular trade. In 1833, just 7 days before his own death, a bill he had introduced was passed, and it was called the British Emancipation Act. All slaves in the British Empire, the colonies, in England itself, everywhere, were freed. He was the instrumental force who ushered in both of these acts, and he died knowing that he had done his best for God. And so this completes another triangle. Wesley, Newton, Wilberforce. But why did I call it the Triangle of Grace? Well, I'm sure some of you know. I'm sure a lot of you know. But I'm going to tell you anyway. The centerpiece of this triangle, John Newton, gave us the epic statement of salvation. The anthem of forgiving the unforgivable. Because John Newton was the author of Amazing Grace. And this has become the American anthem. It's not so popular in England, but it is the American anthem of salvation. And we rest in that knowledge. Brought to us by John Wesley, John Newton, and William Wilberforce. Amen.